And this brings to mind Immanuel Kant, who thought of religion as evolving from the most embodied and mythological towards the most abstract and rational. For him, religion is a tree pruned by history in order to eventually produce the most pure ethical fruit. And that fruit, of course, ends up being Christianity, preferably Protestantism, preferably the German kind, which he claims has arrived at the most universal truth. And now that this has taken place, we can do away with the almost fairy tale-like stories of Genesis and Exodus, of Jesus' body, the resurrection, and so on. And then we can simply extract the pure ethical essence, which for him is the core message of the gospel. So the thousands of years of biblical mythology can now be understood by swallowing one pill that is the categorical imperative. What this is no different from Adam eating the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. Kant is really no different from Adam when it comes to religion, and philosophy is his Eve. What he did was he took an ethical lesson from the gospel, which truly is there, but then absolutized this one truth, claiming he has arrived at the essence of religion. He picked a fruit and said, this is it. This is the final thing that will save everyone. He drew one bucket of water from the well and thought it would satisfy thirst forever. In this way, he made religion so much cheaper than what it actually is. But not to pick on Kant himself, he was a product of his own times. There were many of his time that started thinking of religion as simply morality. While morality is one aspect of religion, it in no way exhausts the infinite richness of the religious stories, ritual, liturgy, community, and worship. In face of the vast sea of spiritual wisdom that religion and the myths provide, morality is but a tiny drop. So the difference between mythology and ideology is also analogous to the difference between an icon and an idol. Actually, etymologically, you can find some similarities between the word idol and idea and then ideology. An icon is an image of the divine which relates us via visible reality to the contemplation of the ineffable. An idol is an attempt to trap the divine essence in the visible form of usually a sculpture. An icon is true to the principles of apophaticism. That is the idea that we can never describe the divine exhaustively. Divine essence always remains a darkness to us. No matter how much we try to understand it, it always evades our grasp. The Cappadocian fathers, that is Saint Basil, Saint Gregory of Nyssa, and Saint Gregory the theologian of Nazianzus, said it is akataliptos, that means ungraspable. We can have glimpses of divine love, goodness, beauty, etc. They call them divine energies, but we can't see their source. We can eat the fruit, but we can't eat the tree. Mythology is apophatic, while ideology is apodictic. What do I mean by that? Mythology is open to interpretation. Ideology is something that, once established, is not open to interpretation. Ideology is the interpretation. We can argue whether an ideology is right or wrong, but it is as it stands. There is no other reality to which it relates us. For myth, though, there is no single exclusive correct interpretation. As soon as we try to present one like that, we are creating an ideology. However, it also doesn't mean that any interpretation goes. There must be some criteria by which we distinguish a good interpretation from a bad interpretation. Look at the Adam and Eve story. The story itself is just a story, a certain image described in the book of Genesis. Now, I don't believe that the story's essence is exhausted by the words written in this book of Genesis, in the Torah. The way I understand it, and the way most ancient people understood it, is that the biblical account is simply that, an account, a summary. And the purpose of the scripture is to refer us to an autonomous reality of the events themselves. We are not supposed to stop at the level of the written word, but elevate the mind to the contemplation of the real event. And I mean, this is quite obvious when we think about this. You know, it is said that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, right? But before Moses, people somehow they knew about these stories, so they didn't even have them written down. And this, as I mentioned, is the way people used to read this story, as well as all the other biblical and mythological stories for thousands of years, up until modernity and rationalism. And this is why ancient people could tell that story in many different ways, adding different details and connecting it with other stories. And they didn't feel they were somehow altering or distorting the original message. This is how they thought of, for example, apocryphal texts. If you look at things like the Book of Jubilees or the life of Adam and Eve, these are apocryphal books which contain expanded accounts of the same events from Genesis. Even though they were written down much later, there was no problem for these people to accept them as bringing some sort of insight into the rather condensed and difficult to understand narrative of the book of Genesis. And these people were so immersed in the reality of the myth, they were participating in this myth in such a way that when they added some elements which were not explicitly stated in the canonical scriptures, nobody had an issue with that. Well, unless they were outrightly heretical, of course, because they could judge the soundness of that addition based on their lived experience of the myth. They didn't treat the scripture as a fetish, an idol, but rather as an icon that points beyond itself. Now, I couldn't find a reference to this, to what I'm going to say now, but I've heard about an experiment done in a community which had a live tradition of oral storytelling. It's kind of ironic because right now I'm kind of participating in oral culture, right? I've heard this somewhere. I'm just relating it. So in this community, they had one person tell a story to an audience, and then at a different time, they had another person tell the same story to the same people. And the people had previously been familiar with the story. So let's say it was some ballad or myth, right? Like what the Homeric rhapsodes would tell, or like what we have in this picture here. We have a bayan, which is a Slavic version of kind of the same thing. It took so in this instance, it took the first storyteller an hour to tell the story, while it took the second one only 30 minutes to tell the same story, and speaking at relatively the same pace. They then asked the audience if the second storyteller missed anything from the story, and the people responded that nothing was missing, and the story was presented just as carefully as the previous time. What can we infer from this? That the essence of the story lies not so much in the written or said account, but in the autonomous reality of the story itself. A traditional story, a myth, has its own being, not resting on any individual telling of it. It doesn't belong to anyone. It has a life of its own, in which the storyteller participates. I believe that when a culture insists on a single authoritative document as the exclusive source of truth for its myth, as do some branches of Protestantism and Islam, it signals that the myth has already lost its vitality within that culture. In such cultures, people no longer live within the myth and aren't able to naturally discern sense from nonsense. Instead, the interpretation of these stories must now be imposed by scholars, as the broader culture has distanced itself from the myth's intrinsic living meaning. Modern versions of Protestantism hold to the myth of Christianity on a thin thread, a thread of rationally constructed dogma imposed on a culture which barely believes in the truth of the myth. Its logical consequence is secularization, which has gradually taken over all the Protestant countries in Europe and America. And in Muslim countries, it's kind of the opposite, where uh, it turns into religious fundamentalism. But I think these are two sides of the same coin, really. It's just that in both of these instances, the people have lost the kind of organic connection to the myth. So now on to part 3 about today. Myth today. We've said a lot about tradition, religion, and ancient societies, but how can we relate that to our modern age? What role has mythology to play in our lives today? As I mentioned in the beginning, it is impossible to escape mythology. It stands at the core of our understanding of the world, of language, culture, ethics. But what is the current myth? Max Horkheimer makes a compelling point that the European Age of Reason, with its Enlightenment, tried to get rid of mythology once and for all, but only ended up creating just another myth. The myth of reason and science, the myth of materialism, mechanism, rationalism, secularism, and other isms. In face of cultural division, after the bitter religious wars of the 16th century, European intellectuals sought a way to fix human identity, ethics, unity, and find the one final correct interpretation of reality, but they only ended up building a new Tower of Babel. The rationalist myth might still be the most widespread worldview people in Western countries hold to, but this has been rapidly changing during the last about 10 years. The late 20th century and early 21st century was the time of philosophical hegemony for the physicalists, the materialists, reductionists, and the so-called new atheists. But something has visibly been changing since the 2010s. And why do I think this worldview is on the decline? I think it's because people have started to realize that rationalism is a bad myth. It's a bad story in terms of bringing people into flourishing. People need a good story in order to flourish. And something like science alone does not provide it. Ethics, morality, meaning in life, people need those things, and secularism is barren of those. Secular people are left with a void, which longs for myth, story, narrative, just a way to make sense of the world. This is why we see alternative worldviews like the LGBT movement, like New Age spiritualities, astrology, neo-paganism. These are just rampant today. But even the obsession with politics, race, gender, these are all ways to fill that you say myth-shaped hole in people's hearts. So we were dissatisfied with the Enlightenment. We saw it was not a good foundation for culture building. So we went looking for meaning everywhere else. This was both a good thing and a bad thing. The good thing is that people saw through the kind of shallow nature of the secular worldview, and are breaking free from its barrenness. But there is a danger in this, because secularism, although bland and boring, did provide people with a sense of security, a firm footing on reality, a feeling of normality. People would lead regular lives in regular houses, working regular jobs, raising regular children. Now, however, once that cradle of comfort is broken, there is a great spiritual danger of falling into the hands of deceptive myths and narratives, forces of a more nefarious nature. This is a time of great potential for people, but also of great risk. We live in a time when everyone is left to choose their own myth, their own narrative, and their own values for themselves. Hopes for the future. What can we do to protect ourselves? How do we choose our own myth? How do we build this communion today? First of all, I think we have to start with ourselves before we try to impose anything on society. We first need to figure out what is the myth that we believe in ourselves. And not just as a kind of confession of faith, but like, what is it that captures me? What is it that I can put my trust in? And the only way to do that, in my estimation, is to develop a sense for beauty, which I believe will, in fact, save the world, as a famous person once said. We also shouldn't make up our own myth, but look for something that has stood the test of time, something that is like a strong tree with deep roots, and we see that it brings forth good fruit, something that can establish a community based on love and mutual respect. So my concluding message is, let's strive to find the best myths and tell good stories, which will lead us and our audiences to the contemplation of beauty, goodness, and truth. By embedding ourselves in good stories, we put ourselves on a path to salvation. And human salvation is at the core of all lasting traditions. It is what orients us to virtue and excellence. It is what allows us to endure suffering and transfigure it into flourishing. After all, the fragrant rose is born of a thorny stalk, the lotus emerges from the mud, and it is the cross that brings forth resurrection. So let me end this with a quote from the Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi, and think about what it says about the infinity of wisdom that we can draw from mythology. Junmang was on his eastward way to the vast sea when he came across Yuan Fang, who asked, "Where are you going?" Junmang said, "I'm going to the vast sea." Yuan Fang asked, "What are you going to do there?" Junmang answered, "The vast sea is something you cannot fill by pouring in water, and you cannot drain by drawing water. I'm going there for a journey."
Yeah, right. Well, of course, I agreed with a lot of what Jan said. I think I would start from a slightly different position, not incompatible with him, but I want to say why I think myths are important. And I think that throughout history, people, human beings, have seen themselves as in some way oriented to something beyond themselves. We have intimations of transcendence, I could say, obviously, particularly in morality, which Jan spoke about, and in ethics. So I think most of us recognize that we have duties that we haven't chosen, obligations that don't come from human choice, but which we simply have to abide by. And that's, you might call that conscience. I think that's very deep in human nature. We also have ideas of a truth that goes beyond usefulness. So, if you think of science, which I don't disparage in any way, we're not trying to just do technological things. We're trying to find out, for its own sake, really, what the world is like. And obviously, we've had some success in that. And also, I think very much in feelings of or sensations of beauty, both natural and artistic. And all these things seem to me to point to something beyond the purely worldly, beyond the purely human, indeed, towards transcendence. Now, it seems to me that, well, not seems to me, it is true that people who've thought deeply about transcendence all say, as far as I can see, that we can't grasp this. We can't grasp it literally. Aquinas, of course, said that we had to work through analogy. But I think, and this is where I very much agree with Jan, well, he didn't quite say this, but I think this might have been part of what he was saying, that our sense, these intimations of transcendence I've just mentioned, that take us beyond what we can say literally, are diffused to us, in human culture through myths. And I think that most of these myths that I'm interested in, although I would distinguish these myths from purely worldly myths like Marxism, for example, these myths all present themselves as, in some way, being handed down to us by or through the divine. And that's how I would look at it. I would take this idea seriously and see where it might lead us. I think it might be true as well. Now, I have a very nice quotation from Egidio de Viterbo, a Florentine, well, actually wasn't Florentine, but an Italian cardinal, in fact, of the early 16th century, who says that the divine ray cannot reach us unless covered by poetic veils. So I see the myths as the poetic veils that give us some understanding, more than understanding, some emotional attachment to this transcendent that we can't actually reach directly or literally. Now, one point on which I very much agreed with Jan was that one shouldn't try to pare away from the myths some essence that is not itself mythical. And here I'm reminded of a rather analogous quotation or statement by Tolkien, who criticizes biblical fundamentalists who want to get the precise truth of what the New Testament means by paring away everything they think is an accretion from later interpretation, and so on and so forth. Tolkien says that the people who want to reach the sapling beneath the bark and the branches are likely to kill the sapling as well as the tree. So I think we should respect what the different myths tell us, not as being literal truth, but as being, in their own way, pointers to something that we as human beings can't adequately conceptualize. I would oppose people like the theologian John Hick, who thinks that you can get some conflation of all the myths and some universal truth by paring away the symbolic coverings of the myths. I would say that each myth may have its own kind of its own analogies, its own metaphors. I'm going to say metaphor. I know some theologians don't like this, but they're their own metaphors, all of which have some branch, something true to tell us. I would say, and here I again follow Tolkien, who in fact criticized C.S. Lewis, the Narnia Chronicles, as being allegorical. And now, an allegory is something where, in the allegorical story, you've got, as it were, a one-to-one correspondence between what the story is saying and what it actually refers to. So, I mean, actually, to be honest, I've never read the whole of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but I think it's pretty obvious that you can identify certain characters in that with certain characters from the Gospels. Contrast that with Tolkien's own Lord of the Rings, in which you can't identify any of the characters with particular characters from the Christian myth, but nevertheless, I think you could still say that it is a Christian myth, the Lord of the Rings. I would talk here, following Goethe, I would distinguish between symbolism and allegory. And Goethe says, symbolism transforms the appearance into an idea, the idea into an image, and in such a way that the idea remains infinitely powerful and unattainable in the image, even if expressed in every language would remain unattainable. So I think a myth, a metaphorical myth, a symbol, is symbolic. So they're endlessly open-ended. And I think Jan did actually touch on this. And I mean, if you take the Christian myth, I'm not a New Testament scholar, but I can't find in the New Testament, and I have read it, any mention of the Trinity, or indeed actually of the Incarnation. Now, you could say that they're there in German. I think that would be reasonable. But these aspects of the myth only became apparent in the third and fourth, if they're even apparent now, in the 3rd and 4th century AD. So a myth is capable, and indeed it should develop, as Newman says in The Development of Doctrine. And I see this as a very fruitful aspect of myth, that it's a living thing. And again, I think Jan would agree with this. So Immanuel Kant, the sage of Königsberg, may have tried to get the abstract essence of the myth, but actually he probably, I mean, I don't think anybody really believes in the categorical imperative. Nobody's moved by it, I don't think. Well, maybe some people are, but it's not a living thing, and it doesn't really tell us what to do. Whereas if you take the myths in, of religious importance, they very much tell us what to do, and they tell us through, largely, I would say, through storytelling. So I think that I'm probably throwing light on things that Jan said, maybe from a slightly different angle. Maybe he would like to comment on this. I would, though, just say that I would distinguish the myths I'm talking about, which are open-ended and pointing beyond human life, to the modern myths. I mentioned Marxism, you could think of Nazism, you could think of various other political myths of that sort, which are maybe greenism. These are utopian myths, which say, very much say, that we can reach heaven on earth. Now, I would simply point, I won't argue against this at any length, but I would simply point to the end of the book of Revelation, which modern mythologists often point to. And I would say you should remember that in the book of Revelation, the New Jerusalem descends from heaven. It is not built up by us from earth. And it seems to me that the power of myths, if it's not going to be distorted and or the myth and made into a kind of secular oppressive ideology, you've got to think that what the myth is aiming at is not itself attainable. It's a transcendent thing, object, not an object at all, of course, a transcendent being beyond this earth. And it seems to me that the myths that Jan and I are interested in are all pointing in that direction, but throwing different light on it. I do also think, by the way, I'll just finish, that all these myths have been distorted by fanatical followers who've tried, and I don't think it's not just Protestants who've done this, not at all, and people who've, religious bureaucrats who don't recognize that the myth is fundamentally open-ended and think they can not just apply their own interpretation, but enforce their own interpretation on everybody else and even kill them in the process. That's it.
Jan, any comments on Anthony's remarks following your talk?
I mean, I agree. Yes, I think I would agree with everything that you said. I think it was very interesting what you said about how the New Testament doesn't contain like something like the Trinity. Well, if I'm thinking what you mean is that there's no like dogmatic formulations, just like rational formulations of dogma, right? Because I found this recently when I was reading the Quran, because I never read the Quran. I just wanted to know what it's about. That text reads like a theological treatise. It's not a story at all. It's like this is true. This is how things are. It is an interpretation of things, also of events described in the Bible. It is like a theological kind of treatise, whereas something like the New Testament is very different in the sense that it just has stories, of what Jesus does, and even Jesus speaks in parables.
Well, that's true. I mean, I'm even less an expert on the Quran than I am on the New Testament. I mean, I would say yes. I mean, it is. Well, I don't know it in Arabic, and I think it's very different in Arabic. I think most translations make it much more literal than it probably is, and it was certainly treated as a very poetic text in many of the earliest centuries of Islam, I believe, and of course, as you've just said, it is actually referring to many of the Hebrew and myths from the Hebrew and Bible, and even up to a point the New Testament. So I do think there are definitely mythical elements to it. I think it's been as with evangelical Protestantism in later centuries, and indeed particularly nowadays, it's been taken as a very literalistic text. So I would say that perhaps one shouldn't entirely take the Quran in the way that some people have interpreted it, and the whole story of Muhammad and the handing down of it and so on. That of course is a powerful myth in itself. So the myth of Islam isn't contained in the Quran; it's also contained in the kind of tradition and history which surround it, I would say. And actually, I don't know whether you probably know this, but in the not early Christians, but in the early years of Islam, some people thought it was a Christian heresy. So not quite as it's presented now.
Well, yeah,
I mean, not of course the Muslims, but this is how it appeared at the time.
Right. Well, it is an interpretation of things, of especially events surrounding Jesus, right? There is a
Well, and I think about creation, and I think there are lots of things that are quite poetic in the Quran, actually, if you look at it.
right.
But still, as I say, I don't want to argue about that. I would give it a lot more. I would look at it in a much more charitable way than some people are inclined to.
Yeah, I understand, and I think that I think that's a noble stance toward, like,
and you yourself said that no tradition would have lasted for hundreds,
right.
thousands of years if it didn't have a powerful, telling emotional impact on people. And you thought mostly or often for the good, I think you said.
Well, I mean, it depends, because sometimes you can also have myths that are survive through history through things like tyranny.
Yes,
the myth
that is true.
of the
Yes,
pharaoh.
like communism. Yes.
Yeah. So that's why I think there are better and worse myths. So certain myths allow some people to flourish, but then other people are sort of tyrannized by that same myth.
Yeah, and obviously there's a problem with Hinduism in that respect. But some people say, and again, I don't know enough about Hinduism to speak with any authority, but some people say that the doctrine of the Dalits, the untouchables, that is a kind of late deformation of the Vedic tradition. So I don't think that all mythical traditions are by any means completely acceptable, completely praiseworthy. I think a lot of them, including Christianity, have had very bad patches. And this is because the myth has to be worked on and interpreted by fallible human beings. And I don't think Christianity is immune from blemishes of the sort you might be mentioning, Jan.
That's right.
I mean, I don't think you would have been very happy. Well, you might have been. I don't know. Would you have been very happy if you were in Prague when Jan Hus was being torn to pieces?
Probably not. But I love my namesakes, so
Yes.
So I have a question from the advisory board member of the Humane Philosophy Society, who had to leave early, unfortunately, Arlen Corwick. But he's left his question, which he would, and me too, and all of us probably hear your thoughts about, which is whether science, the progress of science, can equip us better in interpreting myth. So there is a way in which you can juxtapose science and myth, but at the same time, science tells us something true about the world. And that truth, even though it's literal truth, might somehow expand our understanding of myth. And Arlen was wondering about that relationship between the progress of science and a better either understanding of or interiorization of myth.
Well, I think science can help us better understand maybe certain contingent elements of the myth, but when it comes to the core, I don't think people understand like God better now with all the technological advancements than they did, 2,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago. I think this is a constant, and I think that's a hopeful thought, because it means that there is a constant in face of all the technological advancement, which is always changing. Science is always changing. Scientific theories, they change. Every couple of years you get a new scientific kind of paradigm. while the central core of a myth stays.
What about something like, let's say perhaps in ancient Greece, pre the Milesian philosophers, the world seemed fairly simple. So the Greeks inherited Mesopotamian and Egyptian geometry, and they were quite happy with making their ships sail across the Mediterranean, and they were quite happy with how they could chart out fields and so on. And the world that they lived in was, in a way, more understandable to the Greek, you could argue, than it is to us on a sort of, purely material level. But they had that level of mystery behind that world, the forces of agency that the gods exercised upon it, and so forth and so on. And with the advance of science, that maybe starts with Thales and the kind of non-practical kind of inquiry into the forces and laws that govern nature, we arrive at, like quantum physics and relativity theory and, string theory and things like that. And so we realize that it's not only this level of transcendent reality that we've got a problem with grasping, and perhaps we need kind of guidance for, but the simple physical reality which we inhabit is also something that is vastly beyond the grasp of perhaps anyone living or perhaps anyone ever. Isn't that also something perhaps that could give us a way of understanding myth in a slightly different light, not only as the mystery behind the easily understandable world, but as something that perhaps also gives us a guide to the very difficult structure of reality that we're struggling with, or something along those lines, if I understand Arlen's question well.
Could I say something? I mean, I think that I'm in no way going to disparage science, nor would I disparage the speculations, of the pre-Socratics, that are fantastically fertile. The idea that nothing changes, or that everything, all is one, or that everything changes, or that the world consists of atoms and the void, or that mathematics is the key to the universe. Fantastically fruitful idea. None of these were scientific ideas because they were all, in a certain sense, myths. They moved into science when people began to be able to devise experiments and observations which showed that their consequences were or were not true. And of course, obviously, the big triumph was atomism, really. But it seems to me that science as a whole is, in a way, I would slightly distance the pre-Socratic myths from this, because I think they were connected to moral and ethical practices. Science, as we have it today, is concerned to describe the world independently of human interpretation and meaning. So therefore, if you take that view, so it's an objective thing, it's true for anyone, if it's true, or the bits that are true for any being, whether human or not. So it's trying to look at the world in a completely impersonal, objective way. And for that very reason, I don't think science can tell us anything about how to live. In learning how to live, we might have to take, or we do have to take scientific results into we have to let them play a part in our deciding on how to live, but they don't tell us how to live. And for that, we have to go to other areas like morality, ethics. I don't think science can produce an ethics. I don't really see what science, unless you mean a kind of anthropology, what science can tell us about myth, because I think that they're operating at a different level, and with different criteria as well. And I'll leave it there. I mean, maybe Jan has a view.
Yeah, Jan.
So I was going to say that, when you do what science does is it brings different levels of complexity in sort of analyzing and understanding the world, reality. Because reality can be dissected in many different ways, right? We can, when we go out into the field, just in our regular human experience, we can see, well, there is a tree, there is a dog, there is grass, But we can also say, well, but this tree, it's composed of branches of the trunk, of leaves, and that those leaves are composed of, cells and molecules and all of these things. And like, who is to say which view, like which level of dissection is the true view? This is not a question of objectivity. It's a question of why we dissect the thing, right? Because in our regular human experience, when we walk down, the field, we I don't think we care too much about like the cells and molecules in the leaves. Maybe if we are Richard Dawkins, but yeah, I'm just saying like these different explanations of reality are there in order for well, they are dependent on what we want to achieve, on our goals. And if we want to, let's say, build a rocket that goes to space, then we will have to think about the atoms and molecules and things. But if we want to, as I said, flourish in life, like bring forth life into being, grow in virtue and excellence, these are things that are contingent. They are not the central things that we should be focusing ourselves with.
Very interesting. What about this? What about, for example, the myth that the world is a disc that's sitting on the back of a tortoise and so on? It seems that with doing even a little bit of science, we can show that this is not literally true. And so this changes the perspective on that particular vision of the world from something that seems to be a one-dimensional appreciation of it, which is that it's a kind of physical explanation of the situation that are in, and it seems to shift our attention to a deeper meaning of that picture. That it's a picture essentially about cosmology and finding the beginning of everything, rather than giving a concrete account of a thing. Just following up on the final point from Arlen's question, whether or not science doesn't perhaps in its advance bring out the level of myth that is important to precisely where it's supposed to make an impact and have this world creating effect, rather than being taken too literalistically to express something that we're supposed to take at face value.
Yeah, no, I think that's true, and I think that could be fruitful. And again, I don't know that people in the old days, before they had some concept of a scientific approach to the physical world, whether they really distinguish between science and myth. But I would remind you that Augustine says that you should not treat the book of Genesis literally. He said you won't go to hell if you do, but you'd be a bit of an idiot, basically, because how can the world have been, before the sun? How could there be a day? So, just even looking at it very much on face value, it's literal nonsense, but of course it's poetically immensely powerful and religiously immensely powerful if you're looking at it like that, which is how Augustine wanted you to look at it. So I think that sophisticated believers, even before the growth of science, probably could have come to that kind of view, that these are truths, but not literal truths. And again, I think we have a very narrow, especially if we follow Tarski and the Polish logicians, we have a very narrow view of what truth is. Whereas, snow is white is true if and only if snow is white. That's Tarski's famous definition worked out in his concept of truth in formalized languages, which I have read and studied. So, but that's a very literal understanding of truth. I think that, as Jordan Peterson said to me, there is such a thing as a true friend, a true interpretation of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Lots of uses of truth that are important and which are neglected in philosophy are nevertheless true aspects of truth. And I think it's truth at that different sort of level that we get truth in myth in.
Yes, so recently I thought of something like, well, based on the myth, which I sort of participate in. It is said that a man, well, a human being, is a image of God, and since person of God is truth, right? Truth is a person. Then the person, like the human person, is also an image of truth. So when I talk to another person, I see truth in the face of a person. And then if I try to think of truth as an abstract idea while talking to another person, then I'm sort of losing track of what's going on. Like I have truth right in front of me, but I'm just in my head, sort of autistically, focusing on abstract ideas, which are, well, what does the word abstract mean? It means that it is like pulled out of reality. It is not a real thing. It is an idea.
All right. So actually, I had two remarks. One is a follow-up with the matter of truth, and I think it might be useful for us. I found this distinction in one of the Polish biblical scholars, Anna Świderkówna, and she describes two different concepts of truth: the Greek aletheia and the Hebrew emet. And the Hebrew emet, which is usually translated as truth, is more about, let's say, a practical truth, or what Professor O'Hear said about a true friend, for example. So true meaning that you can rely on something or on someone. That, for example, God is true or truthful. That means, or his words are true. That means that you can build your life upon or on this on his words, for example. So this is very different from the literal truth of science, or to simplify things, the Greek conception. And the second one is more like a question. If we assume, also simplifying things, that myths and science have different areas and that they are separate somehow. So what are the conditions of, or what are the criteria for a particular, I don't know, situation or this area that we can apply myth to? For instance, is it that only with matters that cannot be scientifically examined, we can use myths to make sense of something, or maybe you have other criteria or something? Thank you.
Well, I think actually, sorry, I'm not going to. I liked your first point. Thank you very much. Your second point, I think actually Jan gave quite a good answer to it at the beginning. So maybe we should pass it over to him, because Jan said, I think, that myths were stories in a way, but not necessarily false stories, but stories that give us a way to live. Maybe he'd like to expand on that. Whereas I was trying to say that science can't tell us how to live. So we have to look in other areas for that. And I see myth as being a very powerful, and other stories as well, but myth being a very powerful medium for showing us how to live with all the qualities that myths have of being venerable and ancient and well-trodden and well-loved. I don't know, maybe Jan couldn't say more about this.
So if I understand your question correctly, you're asking when should we apply myth and when should we apply science to things that we want to understand?
Yeah, I think my question comes from the fact that from my experience in our culture, science and maybe more like scientism is so total, so universal. We should somehow justify the use of myths, and maybe there is that was my hypothesis, that maybe we can point to some matters that cannot be determined by scientific inquiry,
Well,
and it gives us the area of myth.
I think I would go about it the other way, which is to say that you can't do anything without a myth, without being grounded in a myth, which, well, I talked about this, how even when you do science, like your conceptual apparatus does not come from nowhere, right? It is not a view from nowhere. Your concepts, even your physical, scientific concepts, they come from like some larger narrative, which is, you could say, meta-rational.
I can see your point, but I'm not a scientist, scientist myself. But I would agree with you. But I could imagine that people with more scientific mindset would try to somehow escape this by saying, I don't know, that maybe they have this narrative, or they found their own motivation for doing science, but this is not about science itself. It's another thing, that they need myths to operate in life, and probably they would somehow argue that science for its own sake has its reasons and it doesn't need any sort of like justification in myth.
Well, but what is science for its sake? Isn't that also a certain narrative? Isn't that like doesn't that also have some kind of value judgment within it, right? Like, well, if I'm a scientist, like believing in scientism, let's say, I will try to follow like things like truth, right? I see the value in something like truth, in the pursuit of knowledge, right? These are not things that are objective and like um, outside of morality.
Well, I take it, I look at it a different way. I mean, you can study quantum theory if you want, which I think is fascinating, and all the descendants of quantum theory till your heart's content, but it won't tell you what to do if somebody asks you to steal or tell a lie, and it shouldn't, because that's whether you think it's worth investigating the quantum world is another question. That's obviously a value question. But science itself can't tell you that. That comes from something else, some other arena. And I think that the Aristotelian idea that to a certain degree, knowledge is good, understanding how the world works, knowledge is good for its own sake. I mean, I think that is a powerful ethical principle, ethical, I think, principle which you can defend and give good reasons for. But you won't find them in science itself. This is my point, that science always, insofar as it restricts itself to what it's doing, is in a sense value neutral. And I will stand by that. I know there are lots of criticisms of this, but in the sense I'm explaining value and fact and so on, I think science is value neutral. It may not be value neutral whether you engage in certain aspects of science, but the science itself is value neutral. Whether it's true or false has nothing to do with what we think. We might want a certain, medical cure to be proven or something, but if the world doesn't allow it, it won't. It's not up to us. And we don't have any kind of decision in the matter. So scientism is what's called scientism, is when people try to apply what they think are the rational principles of science into areas where science itself is silent. And that's where I think a lot of the difficulties arise from. Because then, well, as you said, Jan, they're quickly at a loss with really how to deal with human situations, and they tend to deal with them in a very, I would say, shallowly utilitarian way, which can be very destructive of human life. And they might discover that if they read Tolstoy or Dostoevsky.
So, does anyone have any question at this point? We're probably coming to the end. Boise, I see, is raising his hand. So just please feel free to switch on your mic and go ahead.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so Jan, I think if I'm correct, you think that any understanding that we can have is always mediated via the myth or narrative or the picture that is in the myth. And I was wondering if you have an answer for the postmodern critique of such a stance, that in order to understand, if in order to understand something we need a myth, then we need another myth to build that myth, and to understand.
Yeah, it's an infinite regress of myth.
Infinite regress of myths, because we need to pose another myth to understand that myth, and we are essentially close in a loop of myths, or an infinite regress of myths, and there's no grasp of. We cannot tell where the reality really is. We can only say that there's only myth.
I mean, I think my answer is you might call it fideistic, which is that the answer to this is faith, and I don't mean faith in the sense that it's usually talked about like my confession of faith. It's more like trusting someone. You know, it's like when you're a child and your parents tell you, "Oh, this is a dog, this is a tree." You know, you trust your parents, right? And I think this is where it ends ultimately. It rests on this like love for your parents. There is no like regress of understandings there. It's like as I said, it's a human communion. It's common, you know, like living together as one man, sort of. I don't know if this is satisfactory, but this is how I see things.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, we have to live, and we can't be endlessly questioning. We have to make decisions, but those decisions and the way we live, we can examine them. We're not enclosed in a kind of framework, as postmodernists and identitarians think. We can talk to people from other positions, and we can we can reason. I'm not against reason. We can reason about our decisions and our values, and let's hope that ultimately people in reasoning and considering these things will often come, even from apparent distance, they'll come to a common, or at least a partially common view. Because we're all human beings, we're all living in some ways, the same life with its impulses, its desires, its defects, its notions of flourishing, and in the end, it's against that kind of background that we would have to evaluate, what we think about is worthwhile. And I think that one of the ingredients in doing this would be looking at the myths that have guided large swathes of humanity through many millennia. And I think even people who wouldn't say that they're religious often, indeed, would often strenuously deny that they're religious. They often find, when they look at the myths, that there's a lot more to them than they'd rather cynically or skeptically thought that they actually do think are important, are incarnated in a very dramatic and powerful way in the myths. Of course, they may have come from the myths in the first place, but so I think that if we're interested in learning how to live, I think that you can find a lot of powerful material in the significant myths.
Thank you very much for that. I think we're drawing to the end of the allotted time that we have for this meeting. I just wanted to pick out, as a comment rather than a question, what Anthony has said about Tolkien's criticism of C.S. Lewis and the idea that C.S. Lewis operates in allegories, whereas Tolkien has a much more complex approach to representing Christian ideas. And I think there's one exception to this, which is, of course, the allegory of Christ in The Lord of the Rings is Gimli the dwarf, who has Christ-like tolerance and love for the pesky Legolas, who teases him. and wants to get into all sorts of competitions and disparages him for being a dwarf. And yet Gimli tolerates him throughout and brings him over as a true friend. So that may be the exception. I'm not sure this is orthodox interpretation of the Lord of the Rings, but maybe there's something to it.
Well, there's a lot of humanity in the Lord of the Rings, I think.
Yes.
Anyway.
Yes. So, well, as I said, we've come to the close of the meeting and to the end of the time we have together. I'd like to thank Anthony O'Hare again for joining us to comment on Jan's presentation, and to thank Jan for updating us on his research. I think it's gone a really long way. So thank you both. Perhaps Anthony for joining this evening, and to everyone else, thanks for coming, to asking all your questions, and till next time. And in the meantime, happy Christmas and all best wishes for a happy New Year to you all.
Thank you. Very nice to be in touch with Eastern Central Europe again. Thank you.
Well, thank you also for giving me the opportunity to talk about this.